Absolutely. So, Rob, yesterday we talked about the Negro League's statistics being integrated into Major League Baseball's official statistics. And so that means that, like, instead of Ty Cobb having the all-time record for career batting average, I think his was 362 or something like that.
I think it was 366.
Okay, Josh Gibson now has it, and his is 373 or 372. So things like that, and now, Rob, I think 3 of the top 5 batting averages of all time are players from the Negro Leagues. And that got me to thinking, Rob, what about should other leagues follow suit and maybe integrate, if there were legitimate leagues going on besides their own, should other leagues kind of integrate those into the statistics? And mainly the one I was thinking about, Rob, is the ABA and the NBA.
I thought that's where you were coming up with this was the ABA and NBA. And I'm the only reason I'm going to pause and say no is that there wasn't some diabolical thing that stopped people from playing in either the ABA or the NBA, and they were separate entities that don't have the mark on it, Chris.
Right, it wasn't discrimination.
Right, they just didn't. Right. There's nothing there that says that you couldn't have played in the ABA or you couldn't have been playing in the NBA. We talk about all the time. Dave Winfield was drafted by both the ABA, the NBA, the NFL, and Major League Baseball, right? Like he could have played in the ABA or he could have played in the NBA, where I think the only reason why this works in baseball is because of what happened historically, and it wasn't about people's lack of skill. This wasn't a skills barrier, Chris. It was strictly a color barrier. It didn't matter how good you were or what you could do. If you were black, you couldn't play. And I think that's the difference and why it's important. I know I had people today talk about Ichiro before he came to the United States, Chris. I think he had 2,000 hits in Japan. Right. He could be the all-time hits leader if we include his hits in Japan. And then he got another, 3,000 here, right? Is Ichiro the all-time hit leader if we include his stats in Japan? Again, no. Because at that time, that's where he was playing. There was no bar for him to come. Maybe you'd have to pay those Japanese teams to release him, but there was no racial prejudice or something that barred his ability just based on his skin color or, whatever you might take. So I think what baseball's done here is a little different, and I'm cool with this, but I don't want everything merged together.
No, that's fair. I think what you said is fair. Certainly, it was racial discrimination. Pure racism is what it was.
Right, clear and simple. Right. There's no ifs, ands, no gray area. Anybody who thinks that those guys couldn't play are kidding themselves, Chris.
Oh,
absolutely kidding themselves.
You're not. If you're trying to say that the Negro League's players weren't as good and the Negro League itself was not as good as Major League Baseball, I think that's just racist. Because when you look at what African Americans have done in baseball,
Chris, up and down the right,
they've shown they are just as good as any other race, and many of the greatest players ever are African American. Rob and Martin White said this last night. From 1949 to 1962, they had 14 MVPs in the National League. 11 of them were black.
Hello, is this on?
And all but one of them, Maury Wills, had actually played in the Negro Leagues. So you can't, that's just in addition to the fact that they used to play each other sometimes, and the black teams would win just as much as the white teams, and so on and so forth. So I think, and Rod, we throw in the fact that the Federal League and even a few other leagues have their statistics recognized by Major League Baseball. For you to not raise a stink about those and now you want to get mad about the Negro leagues, you need to look in the mirror and see what your real motive is. Real talk.
100%. And the thing you bring up, do you know why? And we talked about this too a little bit yesterday, Chris, on why all those MVPs were in the National League. Because that was the black league. The American League didn't have and didn't want. I told you that the last 3 teams with black players, Red Sox, Yankees, Tigers, I think it were the 3.
You said those were 4. You mentioned 4 yesterday.
And the other one was the Phillies. The other one was the Phillies. That's what their National League. You know what I mean?
Right.
But those 3 teams were the last. And I brought up Boston because Jackie Robinson broke in 1947. Chris, 1959.
That's
12
crazy.
years after Jackie. 12 years.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Can you imagine sitting in the stands going, what? We still don't have a black player? They didn't care. They kept going.
Yeah, no, I'm sure many of the fans were fine with it. But here's what got me thinking about the ABA. And right, it was before this, way before this, where I started really looking at this. Because when I really sat down and analyzed the ABA versus the NBA, what I saw, obviously, Rob, so many, if you go to the late 60s through really that decade, from the mid 60s to the mid 70s, and you name the best basketball players in the world at that time, Rob, in that decade, half of them were in the ABA. Dr. J, George Gervin, Artis Gilmore, Dan Issel, Rick Barry. You could go on and on. Charlie Scott. They had some terrific players. And then, Rob, because, obviously we talk a lot about championships when we measure players' greatness and all of that stuff. And when I looked at, the ABA and the NBA, Rob, used to play exhibition games where their teams, not all-star teams, but like their regular teams would play against each other. So ABA teams would play NBA teams and so on and so forth. And Rob, they did this throughout, for several years, and the ABA came out on top. ABA won 79 games. The NBA won 76. And then when the last 3 years before the merger, the ABA won 65% of the games. So you cannot say that the ABA was not as good as the NBA. It might have even been better. And with so many of those players moving into the NBA, Rob, I look at what that would do for legacies. Like, for instance, Dr. J. Now, Dr. J is, Rob, guess where do you think Dr. J ranks all time in NBA scoring? Like what number? 30th, 10th,
right?
Whatever.
I'm going to say 25th. I don't know where Dr. J, 25th?
76th.
Wow. Well, he joined the league. That makes sense.
A little later.
He joined the league in what, 76, Chris, or 77?
76, 77 was his first year. 76,
right.
77.
Yeah. So he had already played.
Right. I think he retired in 86, maybe 87,
right.
86.
Right. He only played like 9 or 8, 10 years.
9 or 10 years. But Rob, if you counted his ABA stats, which again I think we've established was against just as good a competition, he would be 8th. Dr. J had 30,000 points total. He also would have 3 MVPs instead of 1. He would have 3 championships instead of 1. And so that starts to change the way you look at things. And I think the one challenge with this, like, it would be easy, Rob, to merge the stats. But the question is championships. So do you just say that for those 10 years or whatever that the ABA was around, there were 2, you know what I mean? There's an ABA champion and an NBA champion. I mean, you could do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just think the ABA has a legitimate case. You're right. It wasn't racial discrimination, no question.
It was just 2 separate leagues, right?
Right. But very close, you know what I mean? And not only the fact that so many ABA players ended up playing in the NBA, that they played against each other and the ABA was just as good. But, Rob, today's NBA resembles the ABA more than the NBA of that time.
No
right?
doubt.
More wide open, more they
three-pointers.
They were playing street ball in the ABA, which the NBA was a lot more sedate and, formulaic and stuff. You're right. The 3-point line,
right,
even off the court, cheerleaders, slam dunk contest.
That was all ABA stuff, right? And Chris, here you go. You can tell me I'm wrong. You can tell me I think part of the disrespect for the ABA, and just tell me if I'm off base, I think the red, white, and blue ball made it like a clown's league.
I don't agree.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
We were kids, so I was a kid. I remember actually having a red, white, and blue ball. We all had
an ABA ball, but I sometimes, because that's the ball that the Harlem Globetrotters used. Right?
Yeah, you might be right. I don't think you're right, but again, I was a kid at the time.
But am I right about the Globetrotters? Didn't they use that ball, right? A red, white, and blue ball?
I think
Rob G, check that out for us, please. I'm almost positive that they did.
But I don't think that's it. I think it's just, it was, Rob, let's face it, it's competition, right? The NBA was trying to squash the ABA.
Oh,
and
no doubt.
To some degree, right, they did, and they want to be, we're the king league. And but you could be right. I don't think it's that.
He picked, Rob G did look it up, and I'm right. The Globetrotters used the red, white, and blue ball, because it was colorful, it was entertaining, it was of that ilk, whereas you're right, the NBA was more drab, you know what I mean, Chris, and more.
They didn't have cheerleaders at halftime doing dance or in between, breaks and things like that. The other league, Rob G, we were talking about this before the show, and he mentioned the Japanese league, as you did with Ichiro. And my thing to that, I guess, is similar to your argument against the ABA. I said, number one, it wasn't racial discrimination. There was no discrimination that, as to why the leagues were separate. And two, that's a whole nother country. And not even a whole nother country. That's a whole nother continent. I mean, you can't just include that's the other side of the world. I don't think that's understandably separate. At least the ABA, it was here in America, and it became an integral part of the NBA.
I hear you.
That would be my argument.
That's not ridiculous. I mean, I get it if you wanted to somehow combine the two and make it just basketball, kind of like. See, if it was like you have in baseball, the American League and the National League made up the major leagues. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
If you had the ABA and NBA, comparison. Chris, and they make up major basketball league. You know what I mean? Like that, it'd be ABA, NBA, American League, National League. I think that it would have to be of that ilk. If you were to try to make it mesh.
Well, let me ask you this before we open it up to callers. I mean. And I don't know how much you delve into the rankings yourself other than just when we talk about it, but Dr. J, now he's got 1 championship and 1 MVP in the NBA. If he were now a guy that, say, had 3 MVPs and 3 championships, that would change kind of where we rank Dr. J?
There's no doubt about it.
You know what I mean?
And to be honest, I think the sad part is, Chris, because the ABA didn't survive, and those 4 teams, for people who don't know, you can look it up, but 4 teams went into the NBA.
Nuggets, Pacers,
and
who was the 4th?
Who was
Spurs,
the other one?
Nuggets, Pacers, Nets.
And the Nets. Right, yep. And the Nets. Those are the 4 that made it in.
So it wasn't an equal merger. That's the other thing.
No, and that's the other thing, too.
That's why the NBA holds the power, because
exactly. That's my point. Right. There's only 4 teams going into the league. Yep. It wasn't like it was 12 and 12, or something like that.
The ABA only had about 11, 12 teams, and that's the thing. The NBA always had more teams, so that part is legitimate. But I last thing I'll say, Rob, I've thought about, look, when Jerry West won his only ring in 72, half the best players in the world were in the ABA. When that's Wilt's second ring. When Oscar Robertson won his only ring, half the best players in the ABA. Kareem's first ring. The Knicks' 2 championships. Half of the best players in the world weren't even in the NBA. So that, you know what I mean? If we do value those championships, I'm thinking we should value the guys that won it in the ABA just as much. Rick Barry, I know he won the NBA. I think he might have got one in the ABA too. But yeah, so it's interesting.